current global monetary system, the reserve currency, Eurodollar, not dollar, has reached the end of its useful life. And that means something else needs to replace it. But what? The key distinction between dollar and Eurodollar is about ledger money and really who keeps the ledger. Contrary to maybe popular belief, we have been moving toward a ledger money system not for years, not for decades, but for centuries. And that has opened the door to other types of efficient ledger money, including cryptocurrencies, starting with Bitcoin. But has Bitcoin in particular been living up to the promise that was given when Bitcoin was first created all those many years ago? It's fair to ask, did Bitcoin take a wrong turn in its attempt to take over as the latest evolution and the latest evolutionary step in humanity's drive toward ledger money?
I started looking into the monetary system just sort of by accident as a young portfolio manager doing research. And running across some things that were happening in the real monetary system, real banking system, it didn't seem to make sense. So back then, there weren't a whole lot of resources like we have today. I mean, on the internet, you can find pretty much anything. In fact, maybe we have too much information. But back then, it was really, if you wanted to talk about money or even think about money, there was really only a couple sources. On the one side, what really fit with, I think, what most people would consider the monetary discussion, you had, Hayek and the Austrian economics. You had real money, sovereign money, money that was scarce, freedom. That was the one side. And of course, most people, I think, especially in this audience, you're attracted to that version of the monetary system. And you think, okay, that's a good place to go. That's a good place to start doing your research because that's free market stuff. That's the stuff that we want to look at and get involved with, especially since the other side was that guy. And even back then, as a young man, I could tell that guy was full of shit. And even he could tell he was full of shit because if you listen to what he was saying, I'm full of shit. So you had basically two choices if you were trying to investigate money, because in college, and certainly in high school, you don't learn anything about this. You have to do independent study. And so at that early age, it was like, okay, on the one side you got freedom and free markets, and the other side you got bullshit bureaucrats. This one's easy, right? But the problem I had was the truth I was finding was neither. And as is so often the case, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about money, it's not about ideal theory. It's not about government bureaucracy. It's about free markets. And markets will do things that often surprise you. And what I was finding that was the truth was neither the free market, or neither the Austrian theory of money nor the bureaucratic Fed theory of money. Something called the Eurodollar ledger. It was ledger money, which was not something that anyone was talking about on either side of the divide. So that was always a difficult place to start. But as you probably may be aware, things started to accelerate around August 9th of 2007. A little thing happened in 2008, which we don't need to get into here. I've spent my last couple presentations at Rebel Capitalist trying to tell people it wasn't about subprime mortgages. What I want to talk about today is what we're going to do about it, what we can do moving forward, because what happened in 2008 was a global affair, a global breakdown. And the consequences have been global. All over the world, wherever you look, you see the same exact pattern. Things were behaving like we wanted them to before 2008. Afterward, it's like the entire world took the wrong turn. And so how do we get this thing back on course? The first thing is to understand what we're up against, to really understand what it was that went wrong in 2008 so that we can be able to fix it. Because it's everywhere. You see it everywhere. And another bureaucrat who's completely full of shit told you that I fixed everything with QE. But he also told you that subprime mortgages was contained, that a fallout from subprime mortgages was contained. But like Greenspan, Bernanke also a lot of truth in what he was saying. There he is. Basically admitted in 2010 before Congress, you know what? There was a global dollar problem. We never talk about a global dollar, but that's exactly what happened in 2008. So 2008 wasn't subprime mortgages, it was a global monetary breakdown. Which means if we have a global monetary breakdown, we should try to fix the global monetary breakdown that actually happened. And so in the years since then, there's been very little discussion about it because of QE in large part. But even in the early days of the crisis, while people were searching for answers, and people have been searching for answers for the whole time, or this entire time, and as they're searching for answers, obviously they're getting pulled in different direction because it seems like everybody who has sort of an explanation for what happened and what's going to happen, they're full of shit too. And so you don't know where to turn. You've got Marxists telling you it's late-stage capitalism. You've got Ben Bernanke and Jay Powell and Janet Yellen telling you everything's fine, the economy's booming, we'll never have another crisis in our lifetime. And people are rightfully confused. But out of that confusion, there has been a couple of really positive developments. One of them was Bitcoin. Bitcoin showed up, and I saw that, and I'm like, this makes sense. This actually makes really good sense. Because if you understand the monetary system that developed before 2008, you see how Bitcoin is just basically the next step in the evolutionary process. We went through a ledger money evolution that led us from bank money to international bank money, all on a ledger system. And now the international bank money ledger system is breaking down. Why not a ledger system that doesn't involve banks? Perfect sense. Bitcoin stepped up at what seemed to be the right time. A peer-to-peer electronic cash payment network. That's a tricky term that we're going to keep coming back to. And so I've been writing about Bitcoin for a very long time, and I've always been very positive on Bitcoin. To me, in an ideal sense, Bitcoin makes perfect sense. But as I told you earlier, when it comes to money, ideal money theory doesn't always meet with practical reality. So let's talk about this evolutionary process, because I think it's incredibly important to understand, because you can't know where we're going if you don't know where we've been. How do we get to where we are? And the truth of the matter is, we've been on a ledger money system and been moving to a ledger money system for centuries. Bitcoin isn't new. The Eurodollar was the first virtual ledger system. And before the Eurodollar, we had electronic ledger systems as far back as the 19th century. So we had the Eurodollar system was a ledger system, and you can find ledger money systems, formal ledger money systems, going back to the 14th century. And I'm sure you can find them further back in history. You can probably find some of those weird clay tablets from Sumeria with all those funny marks on them, and probably about some guy who loaned a goat to his neighbor. So there's been ledger money systems probably from the very beginning, because it makes sense when you understand what ledgers are. And so if we're evolving on a ledger money trajectory, why not the next step? What is that next step? What's really important to keep in mind is how we move in that direction. Where we started from wasn't necessarily store of value money. Of course, most people know that there's really three functions or three roles for money. There's store of value, there's medium of exchange, and unit of account. And store of value money was always the most important because in early societies, you had no reason to exchange money. Think about it, in feudal Europe, you don't need a mobile monetary system or currency system. Store of value was supreme because that's what most people were worried about. That's what most people desired. That was the need. But as feudal Europe, we went through a Renaissance period, mercantile expansion, innovation, all that kind of stuff. Money, as economic systems became more sophisticated, money had to become more sophisticated and mobile too. Early artisans in the Middle Ages, what makes a bank isn't the vault. Early artisans in the Middle Ages, say a goldsmith, for example. A goldsmith would have a vault because they're using gold, and they would probably have some form of security in the form of guards. So they always have a place to store valuables. But a vault doesn't make you a bank. So when wealthy individuals began storing their coins in these vaults, If they were strictly interested in store value, they would store their coins or valuables or whatever it was under a bailment, which just meant I put my property in your vault and you don't touch it. It's just there for safekeeping. That does not make you a bank. What made these artisans start to become quasi-banks was when they began to mingle their coins and other valuables and perform financial and monetary services. So it wasn't the storage, it was actually the act of monetary service. And there was other forms of monetary services that developed as more sophisticated economic systems drove those needs. In medieval Italy, for example, you had a sophisticated money-changing network, which was all about merchants who traveled all throughout Italy or even Europe. You would need different forms of payment at every stop along the way. So money changers basically made what was a cumbersome, inefficient, oftentimes very expensive process a little bit less cumbersome and expensive by offering monetary services. And so merchants would voluntarily give up their property, their coins, to either the goldsmith or the money changer. I'm going to give you some coins, and you're going to give me the right to exchange them into something else. It was a very understated yet profound transformation, because what it did is it opened the door for more mobility in monetary systems. Store of value dominated when you had feudal society and primitive economies. But as soon as we started to become more industrialized and sophisticated, money had to evolve with those industrial systems. In other words, commerce was driving monetary change. And in a lot of cases, that monetary change was driven from the ground up, not from the top down. Free markets, even way back then. So the development of ledger money systems was a way to remobilize and redistribute money through various different means. And ledger money is simply an elegant and efficient way to do so. And what that meant in large part was that you could separate some of these functions of money. You could have a ledger money system that was purely a medium of exchange as well as a unit of account, and then physical currency could be your store of value. And as we're separating the functions of money, commerce was driven in the direction of these mediums of exchange. More ledger money because it's mobile. It circulates, just like we need in a commercial system. Now, there's a number of developments in these ledger techniques over the centuries since then. We can spend a whole lot of time on it, but I'm going to fast forward and focus on just the latter 19th century in the United States, because I think this is a period that is both misunderstood as well as underappreciated too. From the National Banking Act of 1864, it started to create a uniform currency system in the United States. And what that meant was, before then, banks could print their own currency, banknotes, the wildcat banking era. But under the Banking Act of 64, we now had actual national money. This was after greenbacks were being retired from the Civil War, but we had a national currency system that was driven by the banking system, because the banking system was the centerpiece of the monetary system at the time. There was no central bank, thank God. But essentially what happened was banks had the ability to print currency as they saw fit, paper currency. Fractional reserve lending, you take in some kind of reserve, and you lend it out in various forms. But most people, at that time, were more focused on hand-to-hand currency. So banks would issue, before the Banking Act, they would issue their own paper currency, while also having the option for direct loans, which are demand deposits that we all know today. But in the National Banking Act, you could actually take U.S. treasuries if you had them, or you could borrow them, and deposit them with a treasury agent. There we go. You deposit the U.S. Treasury to the Treasury agent, and they would send the order off to the Treasury Department to actually engrave physical currency. So you would create U.S. dollars that were a national currency, but with your own bank artwork and everything else. But it was national tender. These were national U.S. dollars. So banks had the ability to print U.S. dollar currency during the national banking era. And it was profitable for them to do so. We know this from firsthand accounts at the time, as well as massive amounts of scholarship that studied the era. So banks had this option to print their own currency, and it was profitable to do so, yet time and time again, they didn't. Instead, they would turn time and again to the direct loan or paper deposits. And this was a massive puzzle for policymakers, politicians, as well as the industry itself in many cases. They call it the underissuance puzzle or national banknote puzzle, because even though banks had the ability and it was profitable to do so, they did not want to issue hand-to-hand currency. They did not want to issue physical currency, even if that physical currency was a US dollar. Now, some of that was to do with the fact that treasuries were sometimes hard to get. You had to deposit treasuries in order to issue currency. But even then, banks consistently turned to demand deposits, time and time again. And demand deposits were, as Gary Gorton pointed out many years ago, sort of like he called it shadow banking. It's really shadow money. Because again, we're talking about a ledger money system developing from the ground up based on the demands of the free market. The reason why there was an underissuance puzzle is because the commercial system wanted to use ledger forms of money. They didn't want physical hand-to-hand currency. Hand-to-hand currency is just as cumbersome, even if it's a national standardized currency. It still is cumbersome on a increasingly integrated basis to conduct payments. Ledger monies are much more mobile, they're much more flexible. So as the US economy was becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more integrated, no longer just pockets of regional economies, now you had a national sophisticated economy, ledger money was the perfect answer to it. It was highly mobile and highly efficient. But while that development was happening, of course, it was considered shadow money. In fact, most people, most officials and most especially in the government, and economists, they didn't consider it money at all. Again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about a blank spot where it comes to ledgers. For most people, they didn't consider this ledger form of money at all, including the Assistant Secretary of State, and he was not hardly alone. It wasn't until the 20th century that people started to realize this stuff actually is money. Even though it's not physical, it's just book entries on somebody's books. It's an integration of book entries, yet it's used as money in the real economy because the free market drove that innovation. And the banking system was only too happy to service that innovation because that's the way it's supposed to be. Money in banking in service to commercial processes. So even though governments and economics and academics, what few there were back then that studied the topic, even though they didn't consider the stuff money, it was shadow money, in actual practice, it was every bit money. And the people who were in commercial practice knew the difference, or the distinction. They wanted a useful ledger medium. They drove that. And the numbers get to be pretty substantial very quickly. While we were nominally on the classical gold standard in the latter half of the 19th century, money innovation, money growth was all about the shadow stuff. The correspondent network, which is really just a ledger system, which you have independent ledgers that are integrated together through telecommunications. They're able to handle large volumes and settle on a wide geographical footprint. You had the world's largest non-cash payment system in the primitive economy of the latter half of the 19th century. And it grew and grew and grew. While everybody was focused on the supply of gold coins and national banknotes, ledger money came to dominate the economy. Not just a little niche here or there, it dominated the economy. Whether or not government knew it didn't matter. It was driven from the bottom up by the free market. It's any number of statistics would show that, again, ledger money, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, and of course you see the 20th century where it really starts to go almost parabolic at that point. But in 1867, at the end of the Greenback era, you got $1.72 in demand deposits for every dollar that circulates in hand-to-hand currency. By 1897, it's 6 to 1, and you get to 10 to 1, and even further when you get into the 1920s. As Kinsley wrote at the time, 90% of high-value wholesale commerce payments were conducted by check, which today sounds, that's our grandparents write checks. But back then, that was a tremendous innovation. And all a check was a way to access this ledger money innovation. So we're no longer using hand-to-hand currency because commerce has moved toward this ledger system in the direction of ledgers. Because it's much more, it's not only is it decentralized, it's much more efficient. It allows for, highly mobile money allows for the sophisticated economies that industrial societies demand. These two things go hand in hand. But of course, there's a downside to this, as everybody knows, everybody who's ever studied gold and everything else. The downside, of course, is it gets out of hand. The early 1920s, we had a hiccup, just a little tiny thing. By the early 30s, the system, which wasn't prepared for that type of setback, ended up with one of the worst economic calamities known to man. That's the downside to this. And this is where we get into the idea of theory versus practice. While practical commercial agents were demanding a ledger system, they also sowed the seeds of their own destruction. So when FDR came in the early 1930s and confiscated gold, contrary to what maybe most people think, it did not lead to reestablishing the monopoly of government money, because there was no monopoly of government money. And whether he knew this or not, and he really probably didn't, there's no evidence he did, he actually set the stage to unleash the second step in our evolution of ledger money. By removing gold from the system, he essentially left banks to continue to experiment on a purely ledger basis. Again, that was not his intent, but that was the practical result. Again, it's not, our interest here is understanding what happened and why, not what we wish would have happened. So FDR wished something else would happen, and we might wish something else would happen, but from a free market perspective, from the bottom up, we went further in the direction of ledger money after the confiscation of gold. Even the Federal Reserve wrote in the early 1940s that by that stage, hand-to-hand currency had practically disappeared from the commercial system. We were almost entirely on a ledger money system by the 1940s. Gold currency, that was gone. FDR confiscated it. Physical currency that the Federal Reserve printed as Federal Reserve notes, that was mostly as a store of value function. By far, the vast majority of money in any, not just the United States, but any system, became this ledger money system. We're moving further and further in that direction because that's the direction the free market is taking it. So in some ways, FDR kind of did us a favor, though that's probably giving him way too much credit. So step 2 in our ledger money evolution is internationalizing everything. Now, there were obviously ledger money and bank systems in Europe. They were very sophisticated, and they had developed for centuries as well. I mean, like I said before, we could talk all day about the sophisticated ledgers of the 17th century London and Amsterdam network. But the Eurodollar took this another step even further. And it makes sense, because when you think about what money actually is and what it needs to do, it communicates a need. I need to be paid because I've done something for you, or I've given you something. And the exchange of money settles that transaction. So a ledger money is an elegant solution to that problem because it simply conveys that communication as well as the ultimate act of settlement. That ultimate act of settlement is simply recording that communication on a common ledger that we all agree is the common set of books. And so the Eurodollar system was highly motivated as well as really good at integrating all of these ledgers all across the world. Now we don't just have a national payment system on a ledger basis. We've got an international payment system that all uses the same language, the same standardization, the same protocols driven by the banks, because the banks, remember, their goal here, not stores of value, they're not storage facilities, they're bookkeepers. They're ledger keepers. So we have sophisticated banks that invest in sophisticated infrastructure, mostly computers and telecommunications technology. They handle the standards, they handle the protocols, they keep the network running, which is why this Eurodollar system looks like a computer network, not a currency system, because that's what a ledger is. It's the communication of settlement practices. And the Eurodollar did it exceptionally well, and it did it for a long time. And it was so easy that if you wanted to participate in the system, all you really needed to do was kind of just plug into it. As long as you accepted the terms and standards and protocols, it was that easy to access, which is what made it so powerful. It's why the Eurodollar came to dominate the entire globe, because it was easy to use and it was useful. But it was also shadow money. Because once again, as commercial needs and desires are driving innovation in ledger money and banking, officials are out to lunch talking about back then they're still talking about gold under Bretton Woods and gold exchange. Meanwhile, actual commercial agents are moving further and further in this ledger money direction. Officials had no idea this was happening, just like the latter half of the 19th century, because this is a bottom-up free market process. By the time anybody in official position got to understand or realize what was going on, it was too late. The Eurodollar had already taken over. Shadow money, because it is bottom-up innovation, driven by free markets. And the purpose of this system, this international Eurodollar system, is essentially to be able to move money where it was. And remember, this isn't physical money. This is a book entry credit from one side of the planet to the other. We've never been able to do that before. And as economies become more sophisticated and integrated, you need a monetary system that is equally sophisticated, equally as innovative and flexible. And that's what the Eurodollar was able to do, to create a payment system and network that could span the entire world regardless of national boundaries. It's truly international money, driven from the bottom up. Ledger money, that's the power of ledger money. Highly mobile, highly useful. And again, it's outside of the purview of governments because governments are always a generation behind. So we have, as Robert Russa said in 1984, new networks of interbank relations, which perfectly describes what we're talking about ledger money here, but outside the control of the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is still talking about bank reserves and physical cash. It's not about the money that we wish. It's not about the money that government sees. It's about the government that the system actually uses. Whether we see it or not doesn't matter. And this is driven by free market innovation. So as I said before, if that system is breaking down, we've got this evolutionary process in the direction of a ledger money, and you have a breakdown in a system that requires the close integration of massively complicated ledgers, it seems like the next step in the evolution would be to just simplify everything. Why do we need bank ledgers that talk to each other with financial utilities and everything else to sort out daily transactions? Why don't we just have one single ledger? Why do we need to do this as all these different ledgers that need to talk to each other? Why do we need these banks to keep our books for us? Why can't we just do this on a single ledger? That's the next step in the monetary evolution, is to move the ledger onto a common, decentralized, single-purpose thing. And that was the promise of Bitcoin. But I think Bitcoin took a wrong turn, because Bitcoin is not focused on ledger money and mobility and efficiency. Bitcoin's focused on things like store value, something that was supreme and important centuries ago. We need the free market demands a mobile, efficient, elastic ledger system. So I think in asking the question, did Bitcoin take a wrong turn? It's really in the realization of where we've been and where we think we should go here with the next stage in evolution, blockchain and everything else. And so what's been driving Bitcoin, and I think a lot of people's interest in Bitcoin, there's three common, I'll call them myths. One is obviously the store value supremacy, because you hear this all the time, and you hear people who are proponents of Bitcoin say that money needs to be a store value. It needs to prove itself as a store value first. So we're perfecting being a store value. But as I just spent the last 30 minutes talking about, no. Store of value was something we need in a feudal system. I'm not saying we don't need a store of value, but there's any number of stores of value along the way. Almost anything can be a store of value. We have financial markets that are stores of value. The world, the free market has moved in the direction of ledger mobility, not store of value. So that's one thing. We've got that one. Another argument you hear from Bitcoin is that they just simply need to wait for the dollar to destroy itself and Bitcoin will emerge as perfect money from the ashes. And then the third thing is that people, I think, are confusing the price of Bitcoin for progress. So let's take the second one. Let's talk about dollar doomism. The idea that the next system that takes over is just going to emerge from the ashes of the dollar because the dollar is, the Federal Reserve has printed money, the government's going crazy, they're saying all the arguments that you've already heard. Well, we've been hearing these arguments for 15 years, and really longer than that. We've been hearing about how the dollar is going to be destroyed. There isn't a day that goes by you don't hear some news item that people are going to spin into, this is the thing that destroys the dollar, yet every time, it's still here. Now, the modern incarnation of dollar doomism really started when Jackass over here told everybody he fixed things with QE. And as he was telling everybody he fixed things with QE, the governor of the People's Bank of China was saying, you didn't fix anything. Zhou Xiaochuan in 2009 wrote I think it was a speech, but it became a publication of the IMF where he basically said, this Eurodollar systems you guys have just kind of broke down in a very big way. Maybe we should consider thinking about something else. And of course, this made big news in March of 2009 because here was China attacking the dollar when really all he was saying is something bad happened, we should consider fixing it. But ever since then, there has been this entire, almost cottage industry that has sprung up about how China's going to replace the dollar, or the dollar's dead tomorrow. In 2011, China started doing bilateral trade agreements. They had currency swaps with a number of central banks, including Japan. And we heard in 2011, that's it, dollar's done. This is the end. That was 2011. Everybody remember the petro yuan in 2018? The petro yuan was going to destroy the dollar because most people have in their mind that the dollar has something to do with oil. Well, the international ledger has very little to do with oil, so a petro yuan isn't going to destroy the dollar either. And of course, it didn't. But you sense the theme here. And on it goes. In 2021, there was a digital yuan coming out. Digital yuan's going to destroy the dollar. They're going to do digital money better than we do, not understanding the Eurodollar is more than half a century into digital money. It's not actually a viable alternative anyway. And then, of course, Bretton Woods 3, shout out to my old buddy Emil Kalinowski, Bretton Woods 3. And then last year, of course, the BRICS gold fiasco. That as if India and China are ever going to get together to a common currency. They're more likely to be at war than they are to create a common currency. And even if they're not going to be at war, the challenge the challenge before them to create a competing ledger money international system is tremendous. And they're not doing anything close to investing in the technology and resources that would be required in order to undertake the roles of a true reserve currency. Now, I do want to digress here for just a second, because a lot of this dollar doomist, and to be clear, I am not here selling the dollar to you. I'm just trying to tell you the way things are. And so what a lot of people have realized is that, yes, the federal government is out of control in a number of ways. And so they're led to believe, and they want to believe, that something happening in the currency or the treasury market blowing up, that's going to get control over the federal government. And what I'm going to tell you is that no. The reason the dollar continues to thrive year after year after year is because it's useful. And so it's useful in spite of the fact that the federal government has gone completely insane. If you want to get control over federal government spending or overreach, because those two things go hand in hand, don't look to the dollar to solve your problem for you. Don't look for the destruction of the treasury market to solve your problem for you. That has to be done at the ballot box. So there's a lot of dollar doomism that's wrapped up in what is really righteous indignation, righteous anger over what the feds are actually doing. But don't look for the dollar system to solve that problem for you, because the dollar has other uses. It is a highly useful ledger money system. So let's talk about that for a little bit here. What is a reserve currency? I run into this a lot too. Because economics has not talked about money much, if at all, hardly anybody knows what a reserve currency system actually is. Most people have in their mind it has something to do with pricing commodities in a common currency or the local currency, not the local currency in an international currency, but it's really not. A global reserve currency is an intermediary. It's a medium. And the Eurodollar is a comprehensive medium that allows the money to transcend geographical boundaries and borders. Again, we went to communication and settlement. Those are the two properties that are most important. And so a global reserve currency is really just a vehicle currency that different systems can use to talk to each other, to transact with one another on an efficient basis. But in order to be a useful medium, it has to be widely available and also be widely acceptable. And what does that mean? Let's do a simple example here. So you've got a Swedish export firm that wants to sell its goods to somebody in Japan. So Japan's going to import the goods from Sweden. Well, what Japan has to pay for those goods is yen. And Sweden wants to get paid in kroner. Well, the Japanese don't have kroner, and if they send them yen, the Swedes have nothing, they have no use for yen. So how can we get these two parties to transact? Well, of course, there's different ways to do it, but they're all very cumbersome and inefficient. But if we have a reserve currency that stands in between, so you have a reserve currency, which means it's widely available and widely acceptable, which means the bank in Japan, that our import firm, their bank in Japan, has access, an easy and available access to this common currency. So they have the easy availability to access the common currency that is also useful on the other side of the transaction. So in Sweden, when they get paid in dollars, they have a use for those dollars on the other side. And usually that use is converting back easily into kroner. It is an mediating currency, and it doesn't necessarily mean transacting in local currencies. You can use that intermediating currency for a number of things. The Swedish firm could get paid in dollars and then convert those dollars into euro assets or anything else on the other side of the world. So it starts out with a transaction where you have yen being paid through dollars to Sweden, and then Sweden invests those dollars in Africa. That's the power of an international ledger money. That's the system of the Eurodollar. That's why the dollar continues to function and continues to be useful all these years later. Despite all of the downside and all of the problems with the government and the dollar system, or the idea of a dollar system, it's incredibly useful. It solves commercial problems in a way that nothing else can. And of course, where do those dollars come from that are intermediating all these transactions? Those dollars come from this ledger money system, this bank ledger money system. In fact, most of the access to the Eurodollar system isn't from Americans at all. It's international commerce, international free markets. Most of the Eurodollar is people outside the U.S. borrowing dollars, quote unquote dollars, from other people who are outside the U.S., and then redistributing those dollars to someone else outside the United States. It is truly an international ledger money system, step 2 in the evolutionary process. But we also have to keep in mind, because it's driven from the ground up free market, this isn't just theory. This isn't just academic discussions. This is real people who have their own motivations, who have their own view of how the world should work, or what they're actually trying to accomplish. And so you got to thank George and Josh here, who actually went out and, well, you tell us, what did you guys do?
We drove across Argentina with the hopes of just using gold, silver, and Bitcoin, because it's so easy to come up here on stage and theorize upon what would happen if the dollar hyperinflates or a currency hyperinflates. Of course, everyone's just going to use the hard money. That's all we're ever told. But it's completely different in practice when you go to these countries and you see that nobody actually wants gold, silver, or Bitcoin. Or
what did they want? What is it that they actually found?
They wanted dollars, and specifically crisp $100 bills, which was really weird.
Well, what do they do with, I mean, those $100 bills they deposit in the bank, and then the bank uses them as collateral to access the Eurodollar system. So even in practice, what you're talking about is, it sounds like they should avoid the dollar at all costs, but yet that's all they really want.
Yeah. And I would challenge anybody. If you think the dollar was going to hyperinflate tomorrow, would your first instinct to be that everyone would just start using gold, silver, and Bitcoin? And if that's your rationale, then why in a country that their currency is currently hyperinflating, why do they not use that quote unquote hard money? And Jeff, I think you have the answer to that.
Well, I mean, you're talking about from your experience here, just with this, and you guys are going to do this again, right?
Yeah, we're going to Turkey.
Yeah, so we're going to road test this even more, which is, I think, a really useful thing. You want to marry what we think about in terms of theory and top-level analysis with on the ground. And what you find on the ground is people don't care. They don't care about all this theoretical bullshit. They just want to be able to do what it is they do, right? They were just concerned about, I want to sell you something. I want to be reasonably assured that I'm going to get paid for it, right?
Yeah, I could go to the grocery store and get my groceries.
You didn't have any discussions with these merchants about ideal money, right?
No.
They could not care less.
That is not a topic of concern for them.
Yeah, because it's about usefulness. It's the free market, right? I mean, that's basically what you saw and you observed.
Yeah, the actual only people or the only person who gave us a good price on gold and silver was using it as collectibles and not even for money, which is, I think, interesting in and of itself.
But that makes sense of what we're talking about here. That's why I wanted to bring Josh up here, because he gives us a personal story. And I guess it's an anecdote, but a personal story that puts a really good example of how things are being driven from the ground up. It's free market, it's use, it's usefulness, right? It's about what people need in order to drive commerce. It's not about money theory or anything like that. So thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Jeff.
And also, yes, obviously, thanks, George, for putting that together. And I look forward to the next stage of what you guys are looking at. The dollar's just useful. That's it. That's the reason why the Eurodollar, despite all of its problems, continues to not just survive, it thrives. Despite the fact you hear every damn year the dollar's going to be replaced, it's thriving because it's useful as ledger money. What information we do get about the dollar system, because remember, even today it is still shadow money. Much of this takes place in the shadows. But what information we do have shows the dollar is as dominant as it ever was. From the BIS, and really if you want to understand how the Eurodollar system works and put together, FX markets are now the most important aspect of it. And one of the biggest reasons why the Eurodollar has survived is because it's constantly evolving too, and we'll get to that in just a second, why that's important. But we now have an FX, which means derivative-driven monetary system. That's the payment networks and financial flows and everything else. It's driven by Forex derivatives. And the dollar is on the other side of almost every single transaction. It's about 85%, but I imagine there's some modeling error there and some measurement error there. But essentially, when you look at the Forex markets, about 86 or 80, really between 80 and 90% of all Forex transactions are the dollar is on the other side of almost every single one. So if you look at the black line there, which is other is really China's yuan. And you see that China's yuan is going up. That's not the yuan replacing the dollar. That's actually the yuan replacing the yen on the other side of these transactions with dollars. Because the dollar remains the dominant denomination, because the currency, the ledger money system that we use is still the Eurodollar system. And because, as Josh was saying and finding out in practice, it's useful. We don't think about all of the work and infrastructure that goes into making it useful, which is all that bank and all the bank that makes the stuff that makes it look like a telecommunications network. But that's what makes it useful, and that's what you have to compete with, and that's what you have to do it better in order to replace the Eurodollar. Again, doesn't matter what has happened over the last 20 some odd years that we've been tracking Forex flows. The dollar share of at least measured FX is relatively constant within a few percentage points. But I will point out too, this is where the door is open. This is a logarithmic scale. You notice a change in trend, massive change in trend, right in 2008, which means that's another measure of dollar dysfunction, but not in terms of its capabilities, in terms of its capacities. So that has opened the door to some competing system. But that competing system has to be able to do what the dollar actually does and do it better. Long time ago, a very smart guy who was actually a government official. In fact, he was undersecretary for the Treasury Department in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, a fellow by the name of Robert Solomon, described what reserve currencies, especially international reserve currencies, must do. First of all, you have to have confidence in the reserve currency, which seems self-evident. Second thing is liquidity, because in order to be able to operate a ledger system, you have to have liquidity in the system because it's a dynamic, very ever-changing environment. And the first thing is it has to be able to adjust with the times. A rigid system will simply lead to more innovation because commercial pressures will drive money into other directions. Shadow money. You put rigid constraints on what used to be a dynamic system, and commercial pressures will drive a new form of shadow money. It'll lead into the next step of evolution, because this is from the bottom up. But by and large, what we're talking about, reserve currencies need to be useful, as Josh found out in his travels, and as anybody will find out going outside the United States as well as inside the US. So that's what a reserve currency actually is. In order to be able to, remember the two things that need to happen, it needs to be widely available and widely acceptable. And these are the three ways in which it becomes that. And it takes a tremendous amount of investment, resources, time, and everything else in order to happen. So back to our question, did Bitcoin take a wrong turn? Well, store value supremacy, and then, of course, price is progress. So store value supremacy, no, we're ledger money, medium of exchange. Dollar doomism, dollar is still the most useful reserve currency, and it isn't even close. So what about prices progress? So let's put some comparisons up here. In a 15-year period during the first U.S. shadow money period, when demand deposits started to dominate the commercial landscape, in 15 years from about 1866 until the early 1880s, you can see there was $1.72 in demand deposits for every dollar in hand-to-hand currency. 15 years later, that's $3.40 for every dollar. In other words, this form of shadow money had already come to dominate the commercial landscape because of the free market adoption in a 15-year period in the 19th century. 15 years is all it took to really dominate. And of course, as we mentioned before, by 1910 at the very latest, it's already 90% of wholesale transactions. So in 15 years of this ledger money adoption, this shadow ledger money adoption, it was already dominating the commercial landscape. And it was only going to get even bigger. The Eurodollar. In 15 years, the Eurodollar went from basically nothing to completely obliterating Bretton Woods. In 15 years, the Eurodollar went from nothing to overtaking everything about Bretton Woods. And of course, it did so in the same shadow money framework. We have no idea how big the Eurodollar was then. We have no idea how big the Eurodollar is now. But we do know is that it came to dominate the commercial landscape because that's what the free market demanded, and that's what the monetary system was able to supply. In 15 years since the introduction of Bitcoin, the price has gone up. We started out with the white paper that said a peer-to-peer cash payment system, the promise of a ledger money system. Where is it? The price has gone up. That doesn't tell you anything about commercial adoption. It doesn't tell you about the free market choosing to use Bitcoin, as Josh found out. It's very hard to use Bitcoin anywhere. And nobody's using Bitcoin, certainly not in a commercial landscape. And 15 years is a long enough period of time. Our previous ledger money evolutionary steps, 15 years, they came to dominate the commercial landscape because the commercial landscape chose those forms of money. 15 years is a long enough sample size to start asking these hard questions. Why isn't Bitcoin dominating the commercial landscape? And it gets even worse, because now you have Bitcoin that's price is being driven by what people say is adoption, but it's really institutional adoption as a financial asset. Bitcoin is a NASDAQ stock. It's now going to be owned by Wall Street. And if you ever want to use your Bitcoin, you got to get it from a Wall Street ETF, increasingly. And then you still have to spend dollars. You have to convert your Bitcoin into dollars. Actually, you have to convert your Bitcoin into Eurodollars in order to use it. How is that a payment system? Bitcoin's promise was to be that next step in ledger money evolution. It made sense. The idea of Bitcoin made sense. As Josh, we're talking about, it's not the idea. It's what practical uses, it's the practical applications that matter. So store value supremacy, that idea, ledger money, usefulness, flexibility, dynamicism, that's what the commercial market wants. That's what the free market demands out of a ledger money system. There is no challenge to the Eurodollar because, first of all, most people don't really understand what a reserve currency actually is and what it needs to do. And second of all, there's nothing that's even close to challenging the dollar. The dollar remains dominant as ever, and that's not a good thing. That's actually a bad thing. We want Bitcoin to succeed. We want something to succeed because the dollar does need to be replaced. But to replace it requires doing the opposite of what Bitcoin is doing. And so prices progress, that's moving in the wrong direction. We want to have a medium, a ledger money medium of exchange that the free market says, yeah, I want that. I'm going to start using that. Whether or not anybody else knows it or cares about it, or governments or whatever, shadow money adoption. So we still remain on the cusp of our third stage of money evolution. It's there. The technology is there. We started out with the evolution toward banks. Banks became the necessary evil that led to the first adoption of ledger money. We needed the bookkeepers. Banks are bookkeepers. That's what they did. Step 2 was taking that bookkeeping and bank-centered money, that ledger money, to an international medium, which was absolutely necessary. The modern world that we live in, the highly globalized society, was made possible by step 2. We may not like the fact that this ledger money was controlled by a global banking cartel, but that's what the free market chose because that was the capabilities. But we've moved beyond those capabilities. Stage 3, peer-to-peer, ledger money that doesn't require banks, common bookkeeping, blockchain. It's there. But no one seems to be able to grab that opportunity and run with it. Because the opportunity is there, there's any number of competing ideas that have sprung up. Stablecoins. Stablecoins are closer to meeting that need of a payment system, a flexible, dynamic medium than Bitcoin is. But there's also a number of problems with stablecoins. Stablecoins essentially are, in many ways, especially reserve stablecoins, just an extension of the Eurodollar system. So they're more like step 2.5 than really a step 3. And so there's a number of problems with that. But essentially we're stuck here on step 2, trying to get to step 3. And my argument is essentially to get people who are involved with Bitcoin to work in the right direction, to stop thinking that price is progress, to stop thinking about store of value, to start thinking about what Robert Solomon did many years ago. The 3 requirements, he called them 3 pillars of a reserve currency. And what Bitcoin is doing is going from the list bottom up. Bitcoin is working on confidence when confidence isn't necessarily a problem. Stable coins are working from the top down. Stable coins are adjustable. They offer liquidity in certain circumstances when they don't blow up because some of them are scams and bad ideas. But essentially, they're working for the list from the top down. But at least they're working in the right direction because those are the 2 most important aspects of a useful dynamic medium. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin is finished or that there's no chance. I think there are still tremendous capabilities and capacities in Bitcoin. I still believe in the idea of Bitcoin. I am still a fan of Bitcoin. What I'm saying here is that I don't think that Bitcoin went in the right direction. I think they went in the wrong direction. And in going in the wrong direction, they've issued all sorts of rationales or rationalizations for why they haven't made the progress that they should have made. If the free market thought that Bitcoin was ideal or perfect money, as some call it, it would have been adopted long before today. The fact that it hasn't been adopted in any meaningful way should raise a number of questions and red flags. Because at the end of the day, and the end of this discussion, when my time is way past up, the end of the day and the end of the discussion is the world is moving toward mediums, useful, flexible ledger money mediums. We've been moving in this direction for centuries. We're just waiting for that it won't even be the last step. We're just waiting for that next step. I hope Bitcoin takes it. I hope something takes it, because we will be on a digital ledger system at some point. The question is, what will it look like? What will it look like, and who will benefit from it? If we do this right, it's like the last two. The last two evolutionary steps unleashed more prosperity across more of the world than human beings had ever been able to imagine before. That's the opportunity that awaits us. If we do this right, we get step 3 right, we ditch this depression stuff, we ditch this instability, and the world looks a whole lot better. We can go through another period of really prosperous, wealth-building, sustainable economic advance, but we gotta get step 3 right. And in order to get step 3 right, we gotta understand what step 3 actually is. So thank you very much for listening to me. I went way over time. Really appreciate it. As always, Josh, thank you very much. George and everyone else.
Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. If you like what you saw, Eurodollar University has a ton more material just like it. We've got memberships available where we dive deeper into the background, the history, the concepts of money, where it's been, where it's likely to be going. And those memberships are on sale right now during our anniversary sale at some of the cheapest prices that we've offered. We've got special presentations, basics videos on the basics of money and the basic concepts. We've got special conversations with guests from Eurodollar University's universe, as well as a ton more material, Q&As, weekly recaps. If you're more interested in up-to-date material, Eurodollar University also has subscriptions, a deep dive analysis where I go very deep every day into the topics that we talk about here on YouTube, but we can't always get that far into them. I also do a daily briefing that tells you every day the most important macroeconomic news, as well as what's moving in the marketplace. Information as well as the special anniversary pricing for all of it, memberships, subscriptions, is available at our website, eurodollar.university.